The Appalachian Mountains are the oldest mountain range in the world, older than the Atlantic Ocean, older than most of the rock formations that make up the continents around them, 480 million years of standing, while everything else on this planet changed and shifted and grew up around them. And in that time, people have been going into those mountains and not coming back with the same story they took in. The Cherokee called the deep forest sections of those mountains home to things that did not want to be encountered, and they were not people who frightened easily. The early Scots-Irish settlers who moved into the Appalachian Hollows in the 1700s brought their folk traditions and their protective magic with them, because they'd learned from the people already there that in those mountains the protections weren't superstition, they were necessary. Tonight, 6 stories, each one from a different corner of what the Appalachians actually are. The strange thing moving through the trees, the cabin that held something in its walls, the folk magic that turned out to be real, the haunted places that put their memories into your body, the hiker who came back different, and the thing that landed in a West Virginia pasture in 1952, and that one woman remembers at the age of 82 with the specific clarity of a fear that never fully left her. 3 hours, every story true. Let's begin. I want to start by saying that Dex and I have known each other for 11 years. We are not people who would coordinate a story or embellish for effect. We are both the kind of people who, if anything, undersell strange experiences because we don't want to sound like we're fishing for attention. We saw the same thing at the same time. And when we described it to each other that night, sitting in the car in a parking lot in Boone, North Carolina, neither of us willing to drive home yet, neither of us willing to be alone with it. The things we described were not the same. I've thought about what that means for 2 years. I've never come to a satisfying answer. My name is Ren. I'm 31. Dex is my closest friend from college. We'd been hiking the Blue Ridge section near the Appalachian Highlands of North Carolina for the weekend. A familiar trail for both of us. A section we'd done 3 or 4 times before. It was a Saturday, early October, one of those clear fall days that feels like the mountains are showing off. The sky, that specific shade of blue you only see at altitude in the fall, and the color on the ridges running from deep red down through gold. We were on the 3rd day of a 4-day trip, moving well, in good spirits, making the kind of easy, continuous conversation that happens between old friends on a trail where you've both stopped trying to perform and are just existing together. Late morning, maybe 11 a.m., good light, the kind of visibility where you can see clearly a long distance through the forest because the leaves had started dropping and the understory was opening up. We were moving through a section of older hardwood, big oaks and chestnuts, the trail running along the side of a gentle slope with the forest floor dropping away to our left toward a creek drainage. Dex stopped. He put his hand out to stop me too, one arm across my path, the way you stop someone when you need them to be still without making noise. I stopped. He pointed left, downslope, into the trees. I looked. What I saw was this. About 60 feet downslope, between 2 large oak trunks, something was standing. It was tall, significantly taller than a person. I'd estimate 8 feet or more from the ground, but I want to be careful about exact numbers because distance and scale in forest terrain are genuinely hard to assess accurately. It was standing upright, completely still, facing slightly away from us. The color, this is the detail I keep coming back to because it doesn't correspond to any animal or natural feature I can account for, was a pale gray-white, not the gray of rock or bark, something more like the specific gray-white of old birch paper, almost luminous in the dappled light. Long limbs, long even relative to the height, hanging at its sides. No visible face from my angle. It was turned partly away, and it was still not the stillness of an animal that's heard something and frozen, not tense, just still in the way a standing stone is still. Like stillness was its natural state rather than a response to something. We stood on the trail and looked at it for what I estimate was 45 seconds. Then it moved, not quickly, not in a startled way. It simply stepped behind the larger of the 2 oaks and was gone. One smooth, deliberate, unhurried step, and the space between the trees was empty. We stood there for another few seconds. Then Dex said quietly, let's go." We went. Neither of us spoke for the next 20 minutes of hiking. That evening, we'd cut the trip short by a day, back in Boone. Sitting in the car in a parking lot because we'd both silently decided to stop the trip, and neither of us had mentioned it out loud until we were both packing at camp, Dex said, "So, tell me what you saw." I described what I've just told you. Tall, pale, gray-white, long limbs, still, and then that single unhurried step behind the tree. He listened. When I was done, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Ren, that's not what I saw." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I'm not saying you're wrong about what you saw. I'm saying I saw something different, what Dex saw." I want to be precise about this because the difference is not subtle and the difference is the whole point. Dex describes something crouched, not tall, not upright, low to the ground, maybe 3 feet high in its crouched position, which would make it significantly smaller than what I described. Dark, almost black. He said the color was the dark brown black of very old, very wet bark. It was facing toward us. He said he could see a face, or something where a face would be. He was careful about describing specific features, but he said, whatever it was looking directly at us from the moment he first saw it. And it didn't step behind the tree. It went straight down. He said like it dropped into the ground, into the leaf litter and the soil, straight down without any lateral movement. I looked at him. He looked at me. I said, "We were looking at the same spot." He said, "I know." I said, "Same angle, same distance, same duration." He said, "I know." I said, "You saw something crouched and dark and facing us that went into the ground. I saw something tall and pale and turned away that stepped behind a tree." He said, "Yes." A long silence. Then he said, "Do you think we each saw something real?" I thought about it. I said, "Yes, I don't think either of us imagined it." He said, "So either there were two of them or," he didn't finish the sentence. I said, "Or it shows you something different depending on who's looking." He said, "Yeah." Another silence. He said, "What would be the reason for that?" I said, "I don't know." We sat in that parking lot for another hour before either of us started the drive home. I've looked at descriptions of Appalachian cryptids and folklore since then, looking for something that fits one or the other or both of our experiences. The descriptions split, interestingly enough. Some describe something tall and pale and bipedal. Some describe something low and dark and fast. I don't know if those are two different things or two versions of the same thing, or whether the distinction is meaningful at all. What I keep coming back to is the stillness. Both of our versions had that. Whatever I saw was still, whatever Dex saw was still 45 seconds of complete stillness while two people stood on a trail 60 feet above it in broad daylight in October and looked at it. It wasn't alarmed by us. It wasn't hiding from us. It was choosing to be seen in the specific way it chose to show itself to each of us. I think about what that choice means. I think about what it was reading in us to decide what to show. And I think about the fact that whatever it showed, Dex was facing us the whole time, while what it showed me was turned away. Dex saw its face. I didn't. I'm not sure which of us got the worst version of that encounter. I'm genuinely not sure. The cabin had been on the market for 14 months when we bought it, which should have been a flag because it was a beautiful property, 6 acres in the North Carolina mountains, an old-growth chestnut log structure with a good foundation and a creek on the eastern boundary. The kind of thing that moves in weeks in that market, not 14 months. The listing agent said the previous deal had fallen through over inspection issues. What she didn't say, what we found out on our own 3 months after we closed, was that 2 other deals had also fallen through before that one. She was not lying. She simply wasn't being fully informative. We found that out from the county deed office, which is the kind of thing you do after you open a wall and find 50 years of someone else's writing inside it. You go looking for the history of the place. My name is Abby. I'm 36. Garrett is my husband. We'd been looking for a renovation project in the Appalachians for 2 years when we found the cabin. We knew what we were buying. We knew the bones were sound and the surface was rough. We had a contractor we trusted named Sal who'd worked mountain properties his whole career and knew exactly what he was getting into. We closed in late April, started work in May. The first 2 weeks were the standard opening up phase, removing damaged plaster, assessing the log walls beneath, checking the chinking, pulling up the old flooring to look at the substructure. Sal's crew was efficient and good. On the 15th day, Sal called me outside to the back bedroom. He had a section of interior wall surface exposed, the old plaster removed, the original log surface beneath, visible for the first time in decades. He pointed. The log surface was covered in writing. I want to describe the writing carefully, because the physical details matter. Inscribed, not painted. Carved or pressed into the wood itself with something sharp. The letters pressed into the grain, faded in the older sections but legible throughout with a flashlight and careful examination. Dated entries, like a journal, going back to what appeared by date to be the early 1940 seconds at the deepest accessible layer. The entries ran from oldest to most recent in a specific direction, bottom to top, left to right across the logs. The oldest at the base of the wall near the floor. The most recent near the top at the level where the plaster had been applied when the interior was finished at some point in the building's history, which means the writing had been done before the plaster went on. Some of it, Sal's crew photographed every inch. I photographed every inch. We spent an entire day documenting before anyone touched anything else. That night, Garrett and I spread our photos across the kitchen table and began transcribing. The oldest entries were from 1941, 1943, 1945, short, mostly weather and hunting observations. The kind of record keeping that mountain families did when this was a working homestead, and the cabin walls were as good a surface as any. Moving up the wall, the entries changed. By the late 1940 seconds, they were less observational and more personal. Someone documenting their daily life, seasonal work, family events, a birth in 1948, a death in 1951. By the mid-1950 seconds, they were about the woods, specifically about something in the woods to the east, toward the creek drainage. The entries through the late 50 seconds described sounds, movements, something that came close to the cabin at night that the writer had seen twice and not been able to identify. The tone of the entries during this period shifted from the straightforward record keeping of the early entries to something more urgent, more compressed. By 1960, the entries had become, in places, prayers, then a gap, a long blank section of log surface, maybe 15 years of wall by our rough estimation, no writing, as if whoever had been inscribing these entries had stopped. Then in what appeared to be the mid-1970 seconds based on contextual references, the writing resumed. A different hand, the letter formation different, the pressure of the inscription different, someone new, 2 or 3 entries, brief, noting that they'd found the previous writing, expressing uncertainty about it, and then stopping. Another gap, another resumption, this time in the 1980 seconds, again a different hand, again brief, again the same pattern of finding the previous writing, noting it stopping, then the plaster. Whoever finished the interior in the late 1980 seconds, or early 1990 seconds, we couldn't establish the exact date, had covered the writing without erasing it, sealed it behind plaster and paint for the next 30 plus years until Sal's crew opened the wall. Here is where the story takes the turn. The plaster covered everything up to approximately the 1980 seconds writing, but on the surface of the plaster itself, on the interior face of the plaster that had been against the log wall, someone had written in pencil on the back of the plaster panel in handwriting that was neither the earliest nor the most recent of the log inscriptions, a single entry, 3 sentences, dated 7 months before we purchased the property, 3 weeks before the last purchase contract fell through, written on the interior surface of a wall that had been sealed since the 1990 seconds. From inside the sealed wall, I'm going to tell you what those 3 sentences said, because I've thought about whether to include this, and I've decided that leaving it out is the kind of thing that makes a story incomplete in a way I don't think is honest. The first sentence said, "It has been here the whole time." The second sentence said, "The sounds from the east are not an animal." The third sentence said, "Do not remove the wall on the east side." We had removed the wall on the east side. It was the wall Sal had opened first. because the east wall faced the creek drainage and the plaster on the east wall showed the most water damage, and Sal had correctly identified it as the first priority. The east wall was the one covered in writing. The east wall faced the creek drainage that the 1,950 seconds entries described as the direction things came from. The east wall had been sealed since the 1,990 seconds, and someone 3 weeks before the last purchase contract fell through had been inside that sealed wall and written 3 sentences on the back of the plaster. Garrett asked me how they got in. I said I didn't know. He said there's no access point. I've been over every inch of this building's exterior. There's no way into the wall cavity from outside. I said, I know. He said, and from inside the cabin that wall was plastered and painted. I said, I know. He said, Abby, I said, I know. We finished the renovation. We did not, after finding the 3rd sentence, remove any additional material from the east wall. We replastered over the log surface, over all the writing, over the 3 sentences on the back of the panel. I took photographs of everything first. I have them. I've looked at them many times. Sal finished the job and left in September. He didn't ask questions about the writing after the first day, and I didn't volunteer information. We use the cabin regularly now, 4 or 5 times a year. We've spent full weeks there. The east wall, the one facing the creek drainage, is the wall our bed faces. I sleep with my back to it. I've tried sleeping facing it. I always end up turning over before morning. Garrett doesn't seem to notice. I've decided not to tell him about the turning over, about the specific quality of the dark on that side of the room, about the sound from the creek drainage that I hear some nights between 2 and 3, 00 a.m. that I have not been able to identify in 3 years of visits. The first person who wrote on those logs heard it in the 1,950 seconds. It's still there. Whatever it is still there. And the wall is closed now. And I'm choosing to believe the 3rd sentence meant what it said. Hey, we're 2 stories in, 4 more to go tonight. If you found this video tonight and this is your first time here, you already know this is your kind of thing. Hit subscribe right now because this is what we do every week. Real stories, real places, the Appalachians and everything that lives in them that doesn't have a clean name yet. Drop a comment. Tell me which one is sitting with you so far. The thing in the woods that showed itself differently to 2 people, or the writing inside the sealed wall. Because story 3 is about folk magic and what happens when you discover the protections around your property were real and what they were protecting against. I want to tell you something that I think is important before I get into this. I am not a person who believes in magic. I'm a geologist. I spent 15 years working for an energy company doing subsurface assessment in the Appalachian Basin. I understand the physical world in terms of processes and timescales and empirical evidence. I am not someone who looks at a marking on a tree and thinks protection spell. The reason this story got to me the way it did is because of what Dr. Pruitt told me and because of what I found after I knew what to look for. Because once you know what the marks mean, you can see the evidence of what was testing them. And that evidence is physical. It's in the bark. My name is Fletcher. I'm 52. I bought 34 acres of mountain land in Pendleton County, West Virginia, 6 years ago as a retirement investment. The plan was to eventually build a small house and use it for hunting and recreation. The land had been in the same family for 3 generations and had not been actively managed for at least 40 years. The forest was mature, the old logging roads were overgrown, the field boundaries were returning to woods. I walked the full perimeter in my first month of ownership, mapping access, assessing timber quality, finding the old boundary markers. It was on the western boundary, in a section of old-growth mixed hardwood, that I first noticed the carvings. A large beech tree, the kind of beech that's been standing for 150 years, with a section of smooth gray bark at about chest height that carried a carved symbol. Not initials, not a hunter's mark, not a property boundary blaze. A specific symbol, angular, geometric, the kind of deliberate design that takes time and intention. I noted it, photographed it, kept walking. I found 7 more on that boundary line, all on mature trees, all at roughly the same height, all different symbols, but with a shared visual vocabulary. the same angular, deliberate quality. I documented all 8 and kept going. On the south boundary, I found 6 more. On the east boundary, 9 more. On the north boundary, 5 more. 28 carved symbols distributed around the full perimeter of my 34 acres, on the oldest and largest trees in each boundary section, at a consistent height that suggested a single person or a consistent practice rather than random individual marks. I took every photo to the Pendleton County Historical Society. The archivist there was helpful but couldn't identify the specific symbols. She referred me to a woman named Agnes who lived about 12 miles up the road from my property, who she described as someone with deep knowledge of traditional mountain folk practices in the region. I want to tell you about Agnes carefully because she's a real person and she's still living, and I've kept her last name out of this for reasons that will become clear. Agnes is in her late 70s. She's lived in that county her whole life. Her family goes back in those mountains 7 generations. When I showed her my photographs, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Where is this land?" I told her the general location. She said, "Who did you buy it from?" I told her the family name. She looked at the photos again. She said, "These are warding marks, protection marks. The family that owned this land, the women in that family, they maintained these marks for as long as I can remember. I saw them doing it when I was a girl. Your marks are probably 60, 70 years old, but the practice goes back further than that." I said, "What were they protecting against?" She said, "The question you want to ask is, did it work?" She referred me to Dr. Pruitt, a folklorist at a regional university who had documented Appalachian protective folk traditions for decades. I drove to his office with my photographs. Dr. Pruitt identified most of the symbols immediately. They were a mixture of Scots, Irish, and German immigrant protective traditions, hexaschilder witch marks, hex signs adapted for the mountain folk tradition, specifically the kind used to prevent entry or passage of malevolent forces across a boundary. He said the specific arrangement I described, a complete ring around a property perimeter on the oldest trees at consistent height, was what he called a closed ward, a deliberately maintained barrier. He said the fact that they're on the boundary trees and not on the house itself suggests the family was warding against something that approached from outside the property, something that came in from the broader forest rather than something already present on the land. I said, "That's a distinction you make?" He said, "In the tradition, yes. You ward outward when what you're concerned about is in the woods. You ward inward when you're concerned about something that's already inside." I said, "What's the difference in practice between something that's outside a ward and something that's inside one?" He said, "The inside of the ward is presumably safe. The outside, whatever the ward was placed to stop, is presumably still out there." On the drive home from Dr. Pruitt's office, I called Agnes. I asked her a question I hadn't thought to ask in person. I said, "Agnes, when the family maintained those marks, when you saw them doing it as a girl, did they say what it was for? What they were warding against specifically?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "They called it the woods thing. That's all they ever called it, the woods thing." I said, "Did they describe it?" And she said, "They didn't need to. Everyone who grew up in that hollow knew what the marks were for. You didn't go to the western edge of that property after dark. Everyone knew." I said, "What's on the other side of the western boundary?" She said, "National forest. Goes back for miles without a road." I said, "Agnes, I found something on the western boundary trees, on the outside of the boundary, not the inside." A long pause. She said, "What kind of something?" I said, "Scratches in the bark. Not carved the way the warding marks are carved, gouged, more aggressive, going into the bark from the outside at about the same height as the warding marks." She said, "How fresh?" I said, "I don't know. Some of them look older. Some of them look recent." She said, "Fletcher." I said, "Yeah." She said, "The family kept those marks maintained for 70 years. You've owned the land for 6. I said, "I know." She said, "The marks need to be maintained, refreshed. The wood weathers, the carvings get shallow." She said it carefully, not as a suggestion, as information. I said, "How do I maintain them?" She told me. "I've refreshed the western boundary marks twice since that conversation. I've documented the exterior scratch marks each time I do, photographing them, comparing them to previous photos. They are progressing toward the ward marks, not fast, not in any single visit noticeably closer, but across 6 visits over 2 years. The gouges in the bark are working from the outside of the large boundary beaches toward the interior face where the warding symbols are. Something outside my property is working on the barrier, testing it, perhaps, or attempting to deepen existing damage, to wear through the marks the way water wears through stone. I refresh the marks. Whatever is on the other side works at them. I refresh the marks. It works at them. Dr. Pruitt, when I described this progression to him in a follow-up conversation, was quiet for a long time. And then he said, the ward only works if it's maintained. I said, I know. He said, the family knew that. It's why they maintained it for 70 years. I said, why did they sell the land? He said, I don't know. I said, the family sold it. Somebody stopped maintaining the marks for however long the property was between owners. Before I found out, before Agnes told me, those marks were weathering. A long pause. He said, how long was the property between owners? I said, 14 months. He said, 14 months of a closed ward on a 34-acre perimeter with no maintenance. I said, yes. He said, that would be enough time for the shallow marks to become ineffective in places. I said, that's what I'm worried about. He said, you should be. He said it quietly, matter-of-factly, the way a scientist states a conclusion from evidence. You should be. I maintain the marks. I will keep maintaining the marks. And whatever is working at them from the other side of the western boundary has not gotten through yet. I intend to keep it that way. I need to explain something about how I experience places before I tell you what happened. At this one, some people are sensitive to location in a way that others aren't. I want to say that without any mystical framing, purely as a statement about variation in human experience. Some people walk into an old house and feel nothing. Some people walk into the same house and feel the accumulated weight of what happened there pressing on them physically. I'm in the second group. I've always been in the second group, which means I've learned to prepare, to brace, to give myself exit routes and time limits when I visit places with heavy history. I prepared for the mine site. I didn't prepare enough. My name is Imani. I'm 34. I study material culture at a university, and one of my research areas is how communities process and memorialize industrial tragedy, specifically in Appalachian coal country. The mine disasters of the early and mid 28th century that took entire generations of men from specific communities in a single afternoon. The site I'm describing is a real historical site. I'm not going to give the specific name because the community around it is still there and still healing, and I have no desire to make it a horror tourism destination. What I'll tell you is that it was a West Virginia coal mine disaster from the 1,920 seconds. A methane explosion, more than 100 men killed, the mine shaft sealed afterward with the bodies still inside. The site is marked. There's a small memorial. The ground above the sealed shaft is maintained by the descendants of the men who died there. I went on a research visit with my colleague Bex in September. We were documenting memorial practices. It was a professional visit. I'd read the entire historical record before we went. We arrived mid-morning. The site is in a hollow, surrounded by the typical West Virginia mountain landscape. The seam of coal, visible in the hillside, where the mine entrance had been sealed and grown over with a century of vegetation. Bex and I walked the site. I took notes. She photographed. Standard research process. I was feeling what I normally feel at places like this. A weight, a heaviness in the chest that I recognize and manage, the accumulated emotional residue of documented tragedy that I've trained myself to observe without absorbing. That was fine. That was normal. That was manageable. It was around 11:30 a.m. I was standing near the sealed shaft marker, about 40 feet from the original mine entrance location, and I reached into my bag for my notebook, and I couldn't remember what my notebook looked like. I could see my bag. I could see my hand. I could not bring up the image of my own notebook, a spiral-bound thing I'd been using for 3 months, and which I saw every day. I stood there for a moment, confused by this specific small gap, and reached into the bag and pulled out the notebook. It looked exactly as it always had. But for those few seconds, it was gone from my memory. I noted the gap, filed it as fatigue or stress, kept working. 40 minutes later, I was photographing the memorial plaques when I heard something. Not with my ears, I want to be specific about this, not an external sound, but not exactly an internal one either. Something in the space between those two things. The quality of a sound that originates in a place rather than a source. A man coughing. The specific cough of a person in distress. Deep, productive. The kind of cough that comes from lungs full of particulate matter. I looked at Bex, who was 10 feet away. She was writing something, didn't look up, had not heard anything. I stood still for a moment, the sound again, closer, or more present, as if whatever had produced it was now immediately adjacent to where I was standing. Then it stopped. And what replaced it was not a sound, it was a sensation. And this is the part that took me the most time to process, and that I still don't have full language for. A sensation of enclosure. Specifically, the physical sensation of being in a very small space with a low ceiling, of having rock on three sides within arm's reach, of the particular quality of air in a sealed tunnel that has had the oxygen content depleted. The specific texture of that air on the skin and in the lungs. I was standing in an open field on a clear September morning, and I was in a tunnel. Both at the same time. The open field did not go away, but the tunnel was also real in a different sensory register, overlaid, coexistent. I said to Bex, I need 5 minutes. She looked up, looked at my face, said sit down. I sat on the ground. The sensation faded slowly over several minutes, not all at once, the enclosure receding like a tide. When it was mostly gone, I told Bex what I'd experienced. She is a measured, empirical person. She listened without expression. And when I was done, she said, has this happened to you at other sites? I said, not like this, not this specific. She said, what do you mean specific? I said, the sensation was very particular. A specific ceiling height, a specific quality of air, a specific direction of the rock face on my left. It wasn't general. It was like being somewhere I've never been with the specificity of a real memory. Bex was quiet. Then she said, a real memory of someone who was there. I said, yes, that's what it felt like. I've sat with what happened that day for 2 years, and I've read everything I can find about the specific qualities of sensory experience at historically significant trauma sites. I am not a person who uses the word haunted casually. But I will tell you this, with as much precision as I can manage, whatever I experienced in that hollow for approximately 8 minutes was not my own material. It was not generated by my history, my body, my emotional state, my research knowledge. It was a fragment of something that happened in a sealed tunnel in the 1,920 seconds. A specific physical experience, a specific quality of a specific space carried in that hollow for 100 years. And for 8 minutes, it was in me too. The hardest part of this to describe is the aftermath, because the sensation faded that day. It mostly faded, but some residue of it remained for much longer than that. For weeks afterward, I would be in a perfectly ordinary space. My office, my kitchen, the grocery store, and for a second, just a second, I would feel the ceiling get lower. Not dramatically, not enough for Bex or anyone else to notice, just a fraction of a second where the ceiling of whatever room I was in came down slightly and the quality of the air changed slightly, and I was nowhere near a sealed mine in West Virginia. It took about 4 months for those episodes to fully stop. 4 months of carrying a fragment of someone else's last experience in my body while I moved through my ordinary life. I've thought about what it means for something to persist in a place for 100 years, to remain in the soil and the air and the sealed ground of that hollow, waiting for a body sensitive enough to receive it and hold it temporarily. I've thought about the men whose names are on those plaques, their experience in the last hours in that tunnel, the specific quality of that air, that ceiling, that dark. I hope what I carried for 4 months was not the worst of what they experienced. I hope it was something from earlier, a quiet moment, a manageable hour, but it was specific enough and real enough that I don't think what happened to me in that hollow was my imagination. I think something in that ground was still trying to be known. And for 4 months, I was the one it used. 4 stories in, 2 more to go, and we're deep tonight. If this is your kind of thing, hit subscribe right now. Every week, there is more of this, more places and more people and more things the Appalachians carry that don't have clean names yet. Drop a comment. Tell me which of tonight's 4 stories has stayed with you the most, because story 5 is the one I found hardest to tell. And story 6 is the one an 82-year-old woman agreed to tell after 70 years of not telling it publicly. Last 2 stories. Let's finish this right. I want to say something before I start, and I want to say it clearly. My husband is a good man. He is a good father. He is a thoughtful person. He is present in our lives in a way that most people I know are lucky to have in a partner. What I'm about to describe does not change any of that, but I need to tell it because I've been carrying it for 18 months without saying it out loud to anyone, and the weight of it has become more than I can manage alone. What came back from the Appalachian Trail 11 days after my husband disappeared is my husband. I believe that I also believe, and I hold both of these things simultaneously, that he did not come back alone. My name is Colette. I'm 44. Neil is 46. We've been together for 20 years, married for 16. We have 2 kids, a 1 4-year-old and a 1 1-year-old. Neil is a serious hiker, has been since before I met him. He does 1 major solo trip a year, 10 to 14 days on the AT or one of the other long trails. It's his thing, his annual reset. I've supported it for 16 years without a single concern. The trip in question was a section hike in the central Appalachians, Virginia, a section he'd done once before a decade ago. He had a detailed itinerary. I had copies of everything. He had a satellite communicator with a tracking function that I could check from my phone. On day 3, his tracker stopped updating. On day 4, no update. On day 5, I called the Trail Conservancy. On day 6, search and rescue was engaged under a coordinator named Webb, a veteran SAR professional who became my main point of contact for the 11 days that followed. I'm not going to describe those 11 days in detail, partly because this story isn't about the search, and partly because the quality of that particular anxiety is one I've spent a year and a half trying to put some distance between myself. And what I'll say is that on day 11, Neil walked out of the woods at a Forest Service road access point approximately 40 miles from where his tracker had last updated. He was physically okay, dehydrated, somewhat depleted, but okay. He had no clear account of where he'd been for 11 days. The last thing he clearly remembered was day 3, stopping for lunch at a specific location he could identify on a map, and then, as he described it, a kind of interval, and then walking out at the Forest Service road. Webb managed the initial debrief, medical evaluation, the process of documentation that SAR does with a found hiker. I got to him at the hospital that evening, and here is where I need to slow down and be very precise about what I'm going to say, because the people who read this will either understand immediately what I mean or they won't, and there's no middle ground. Neil looked exactly like Neil. He sounded exactly like Neil. He said the right things. He held me correctly. He knew our children's names, our address, our history, the specific texture of our life together, and something was different. I want to try to describe the difference, because it's not a thing most people have language for. It was like being in a room where someone has moved everything 6 inches to the left. Nothing is specifically wrong. Everything is in approximately the right place. But your body, which has lived in that room for 16 years and knows exactly where everything is, keeps finding the wrong distance between things. The way he stood when he was tired, slightly different. The way he laughed at something on television that first night, same laugh, correct timing, but coming a half beat after where it used to come. The way he made coffee the next morning, he takes 2 sugars. He's taken 2 sugars every morning for 16 years. He reached for 1. I watched him reach for 1, stop, look at his own hand, reach for the second, like he was checking a reference. I said nothing about any of this to anyone for weeks. I told myself it was reintegration, that 11 days in the woods with no memory and unknown circumstances would change a person, that what I was detecting was stress and depletion and the psychological aftermath of whatever had happened to him. All of that is probably true, but I've watched my husband reintegrate from difficult experiences before. I've watched him come back from grief, from injury, from professional failure. I know what his recovery processes look like. This was different from recovery. Recovery looks like the original person restoring themselves. This looked like something learning the original person. I want to give you specific examples because I know how what I've said so far sounds, and I think the specificity is the only thing that makes it real. Week 3, he called our daughter by her middle name. He has never once in 14 years called her by her middle name. It's a family joke that her middle name was a mistake we've been unable to undo. We have always called her by her first name, always, without exception. He called her by her middle name once on a Tuesday morning, and when she gave him the look, she's 14, she has the look, he said, "Sorry, don't know why I said that," and used her first name from then on. He hasn't done it since. Week 5, he asked me how my mother was. My mother died 4 years ago. He was there when she died. He held my hand at the funeral. He has been present for every moment of my grief over losing her. He asked how she was. He caught himself immediately. His face did something I can't fully describe, a micro expression of correction, of recalibration. And he said, "God, I'm sorry." I don't know why I said that. I think I was thinking of your aunt and moved on. I did not say anything. Week 7, I was watching him sleep. I know that sounds strange. I do sometimes watch him sleep. I've done it since we were first together. It's one of those quiet intimacies that long partnerships have. He was asleep, breathing evenly, and I was looking at his face, and his eyes opened. Not slowly, all at once, fully open. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then he turned and looked at me. He said, "I need to tell you something." I said, "What?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I don't know where I was for those 11 days. I don't know." I said, "I know." He said, "Something was there." I said, "Something where?" He said, "Where I was, whatever place I was in." Something was there. A long pause. He said, "I think it came back with me." He said it with the specific weight of someone who has been holding a thing for a long time and has finally decided to put it down between two people instead of carrying it alone. I said, "I know." He said, "You know?" I said, "I've noticed things." He said, "What things?" I told him, carefully, specifically, the things I'd noticed and kept to myself for 7 weeks. He listened to all of it. When I was done, he said, "I think it's learning." I said, "Learning what?" He said, "How to be me." A long silence. Then I said, "Is it doing a good job?" He looked at me for a moment, then something in his face, something I can only describe as Neil, the specific warmth and self-deprecating humor that is the thing I fell in love with 20 years ago, came through, and he said, "It takes 2 sugars." I laughed. I don't know why I laughed at that, but I did. And he held me, and I let him. That was 13 months ago. The anomalies have continued to decrease. The coffee is right. The names are right. The timing of things is right. Whatever is in there with him, or whatever came back that is in the process of becoming him, is getting better at it. Most days, he is entirely himself. Most days. And on the days that he isn't quite, those days are getting rarer. And on those days, I don't correct him or draw attention to it. I just note it privately and wait, because he's in there. I know he's in there. And whatever else is in there with him, so far it's been kind. So far it has taken care of him. And I've decided for now that's enough. I'm going to ask you to do something before I start. I'm going to ask you to put aside everything you've ever read about the Flatwoods Monster. The newspaper accounts, the television documentaries, the websites, the skeptical analyses, the attempts to explain it as an owl or a meteor or mass hysteria. Put all of that away and just listen to what a 10-year-old girl saw on a hillside in Braxton County, West Virginia, on the evening of September 12th, 1952, because she's 82 now. And she has never once in 70 years stopped seeing it. My name is Eunice, and I'm going to tell you something that I have not told in full to anyone outside of my immediate family. My late husband knew it, my children know it, my grandchildren know some of it, but I've never talked about it publicly because of what happened when other people talked about it publicly. The ridicule, the dismissal, the way they turned what we experienced into a cartoon, into a novelty, into a tourist attraction. Kathleen May, God rest her, she talked about it. She was brave enough to talk about it. She was laughed at for the rest of her life by people who weren't there. I wasn't brave enough to follow her, but I'm 82 years old, and if I don't say what I actually saw before I leave this world, it will be unfinished business, and I've had enough of those. So, it was a Friday evening, the 12th of September, 1952. I know the date because it was 2 days before my brother Junior's birthday, and we'd been arguing about the cake flavor all afternoon. I was 10. Junior was about to turn 13. Our friend Freddie was 11. He'd come over for supper, and we were all out in the yard when we saw the light. I want to describe the light first, because the light is where it starts, and the light is important. It came from the direction of the Bailey Fisher farm, which was up the hill behind our property, a hillside that we played on constantly. We knew every inch of it. It was as familiar to us as our own yard. The light was bright, much brighter than any lantern or flashlight, an orange-red, moving, and it appeared to land or settle in the area of the hilltop. We'd heard something too, a sound that preceded the light, a rushing sound, the kind of sound you feel more than hear, and then the light. We went to tell Mrs. May, Kathleen May, who lived nearby and who was the kind of adult that children go to when they need someone to come look at something. She came with us. She brought her boys. There were a few others. We went up the hill. The smell, I want to describe the smell before I describe what we saw, because the smell hit us before we got close enough to see anything clearly. A burning metallic smell, sharp and chemical and unlike anything I'd encountered before, and underneath it something organic, something I've never been able to name, not rot exactly, something else, something living. It made your eyes water if you breathed too much of it. By the time we reached the crest of the hill, several of us were coughing. Junior had his arm over his face. Mrs. May's youngest was crying from the smell. We had a lantern, and in the light of the lantern, and whatever light was still coming from the upper part of the hill, we saw it. I need you to understand that I am 82 years old, and I have been a practical, grounded, church-going woman my entire life, and I have no interest in making myself sound dramatic or special or unusual. I am telling you what I saw. What I saw was a figure. It was large, considerably larger than a person. I've heard estimates of 10, 12 feet. My own memory is that it was tall enough that when I looked at it, I was looking up at approximately the angle you'd look up at a very tall ceiling. It filled the space between the ground and the tree branches in a way that a person simply does not fill. The shape was roughly upright, a large rounded upper section, and below that, longer sections that my memory renders as something like a draping garment, very dark, almost black. The face, or what was in the area where a face would be, was illuminated. I want to be careful about this because the accounts from other witnesses describe different details, and I can only speak to what I saw. What I saw was a heart-shaped or ace of spades-shaped structure in the upper portion, large, the edges of it catching or generating the light, and within it, or below it, something that moved. 2 points of light, very bright, orange-red, approximately where eyes would be looking at us. I want to tell you what it felt like to be looked at by it, because this is the part that I think nobody ever talks about in the way it actually was, because the way it actually was is hard to communicate without sounding like you're overstating it. When it looked at us, it was not the way an animal looks at you when you startle it, and it was not the way a person looks at strangers. It was something else, something that had a quality of age to it, of patience, of having looked at things for a very long time, from a very long distance and finding nothing particularly surprising about what it was currently seeing. It was not alarmed by us. It was interested in us, perhaps, or noting us, but not alarmed. That is what made it the most frightening thing I have ever experienced. Not its size, not its appearance, not even the smell or the sound. The fact that we terrified it, not at all. We ran. I am not ashamed of that. We were children and adults, and none of us was equipped for what we were looking at. We ran down the hill and misses. May got us all inside, and several of the adults were sick in the hours that followed. The smell had gotten into us somehow. Nausea, throat, irritation. The specific physical response to having breathed whatever that air was. I was sick for 2 days. Some of the others were sick longer. I've been asked over the years by my children, by curious people who found out I was there, what I think it was. I've thought about it for 70 years. I don't know what it was. I know what it wasn't. It wasn't an owl. It wasn't a meteor. It wasn't mass hysteria. 10-year-old children experiencing mass hysteria don't spend 2 days with chemically irritated airways. I know that it came from somewhere that wasn't here, or had been somewhere that wasn't here, and that the air around it carried that place in some form that our bodies responded to. I know that when it looked at us with whatever those orange-red points of light were, it had the quality of something that had seen many things and would see many more, and that we were one entry in a very long record. I know that I have never fully put it down. 70 years, and I still, sometimes in the space between sleeping and waking, find myself looking up at something at the angle you look up at when the thing you're looking at is much taller than you are. And the eyes are orange-red, and it is looking back at me with that specific patience. And then I'm awake, and it's just my bedroom ceiling. And Junior would have been 84 this year. And Kathleen May was braver than any of us. And what was on that hillside in Braxton County, West Virginia, on the evening of September 12th, 1952, was real as the smell that stayed in my clothes for a week, as real as the 2 days of being sick, as real as 70 years of remembering. Whatever it was, it knew we were there, and it didn't need to be afraid. 6 stories, something in the woods that showed itself differently to 2 people standing in the same spot, a cabin wall that held 80 years of someone else's fear, a property whose protections turned out to be real and necessary and tested, a hollow that put a century-old memory into a living person's body for 4 months, a hiker who came back from 11 missing days, carrying something with him that is still learning how to be him, and an 82-year-old woman describing, with the clarity of something that never faded, what looked at her from a West Virginia hillside in 1952, with the patience of something that has been looking at things for a very long time. Here's what 3 hours of Appalachian stories leaves me with. These mountains don't need us to believe in them. That's the thing. The people in every one of these stories had their own beliefs, their own frameworks, their skepticisms and their certainties. The geologist who didn't believe in magic, the folklorist who approached it academically, the woman who's lived her whole life in the church, none of that mattered. The mountains don't adjust themselves to your framework. The thing in the woods appears to you differently than it appears to the person standing beside you, but it appears. The writing is inside the wall whether you open it or not. The marks on the trees are being tested whether you know what they mean or not. The hollow carries its 100-year-old memory whether a researcher visits or not. The Appalachians have been here for 480 million years. They will accommodate your disbelief. They will wait. And one evening, in good light or bad, on a familiar trail or an unfamiliar road or in a cabin you thought you knew, they'll show you something, and you'll spend the rest of your life deciding what to do with it. Sleep well